The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across the sterile corridors as Sarah Martinez finished her third double shift this week. October rain drummed against the windows of the pediatric ward, matching the exhaustion that weighed heavy on her shoulders. She'd been a nurse here for 8 years, long enough to know every unspoken rule that governed this place. "Sarah, we need you in room 312, called Dr. Harrison, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority mixed with something else she couldn't quite place. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed the unusual quiet among the staff. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when she passed, and eyes avoided her gaze. Room 312 was at the end of the corridor, isolated from the other patient rooms. When Sarah pushed open the door, her breath caught in her throat. A tiny baby lay alone in the standard hospital crib, no more than 3 days old. His skin had the beautiful olive tone that spoke of Native American heritage, and despite being so small, there was something remarkably peaceful about his sleeping face. "Where are his parents?" Sarah asked Dr. Harrison, who had followed her into the room. "Mother died during childbirth. Complications," he replied curtly, checking his clipboard. "Father, well, he's not in the picture. Social Services is handling the case." Sarah approached the crib, her nursing instincts immediately taking inventory. The baby appeared healthy, but she noticed something troubling. His feeding schedule was irregular, and his chart showed minimal handling notes. "Who's been caring for him?" Dr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "The minimal necessary care. Look, Sarah, I need to be clear about something." He lowered his voice, glancing toward the door. "This child, his mother was Cherokee. The board has made it clear that we're to provide basic medical care only, no unnecessary attachment." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at the doctor, hoping she had misunderstood. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that some of our major donors have very specific views about certain populations. The hospital relies on their funding. We can't afford to appear to be showing favoritism to—" He gestured vaguely toward the baby. Sarah felt her stomach turn. She looked down at the innocent child, so small and vulnerable, and something inside her shifted. This wasn't the medicine she had sworn to practice. This wasn't the compassion she had promised to uphold. "Dr. Harrison," she said slowly, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her, "are you telling me that we're providing substandard care to a baby because of his ethnicity?" "I'm telling you to follow protocol," he replied firmly. "Feed him when scheduled, change him when necessary, and don't get attached. That's an order." As Dr. Harrison left the room, Sarah stood alone with the baby. The rain outside seemed to intensify, and the fluorescent light above flickered intermittently. She looked down at the child, who had begun to stir, his tiny fists moving restlessly. Despite every warning bell in her professional mind, Sarah reached into the crib. The moment her hands touched the baby, he quieted. His eyes opened briefly, dark, alert, and somehow trusting. In that instant, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She lifted him gently, cradling him against her chest. His weight was so slight, but the warmth of his small body against hers felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I don't know your name yet, little one," she whispered, "but I promise you won't be alone." As she held him, Sarah felt the baby relax completely, his breathing becoming deep and even. She began to rock slowly, humming a soft melody her own grandmother had sung to her. For the first time since entering room 312, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly. But as she stood there, holding this child who was being treated as less than human because of his heritage, Sarah realized she was crossing a line from which there might be no return. The unspoken rules of St. Mary's Hospital were about to be challenged, and she was the one who would have to face the consequences. 3 days passed, and Sarah found herself spending every spare moment in room 312. She had started calling the baby Daniel, a name that came to her during one of their quiet moments together. The official paperwork still listed him as Baby Doe, but Sarah refused to let him remain nameless in her heart. The morning shift change brought its usual chaos, but Sarah noticed the deliberate way her colleagues avoided room 312. When she mentioned Daniel's need for more frequent feeding to accommodate his smaller size, the response was always the same: follow the standard protocol. Sarah, we need to talk. Nurse Supervisor Patricia Collins appeared in the doorway, her expression stern. Patricia had been Sarah's mentor when she first started at St. Mary's, but the warmth that once characterized their relationship had been notably absent lately. They walked to Patricia's office in silence. The older woman closed the door and turned to face Sarah with crossed arms. "I've been getting reports about your excessive attention to the patient in 312. Excessive? Sarah couldn't hide her incredulity. Patricia, he's a baby. He needs human contact, proper feeding schedules, and basic comfort. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities for healthy development. Don't lecture me about pediatric care, Sarah. I've been doing this for 25 years. Patricia's voice was cold, professional. What I'm concerned about is your inability to follow direct orders. Dr. Harrison was very clear about the expectations for this case. Sarah felt her anger building. You mean the expectation that we treat a 3-day-old baby like he's somehow less deserving of care because he's Native American? Patricia, listen to yourself. This goes against everything we swore to uphold as nurses. What I'm upholding is the stability of this hospital. Patricia's composed facade cracked slightly. Do you have any idea how much money the Whitmore Foundation donates to this hospital annually? They fund our new equipment, our research programs, our staff salaries. James Whitmore himself sits on our board of directors. And James Whitmore has a problem with Cherokee babies. Patricia looked uncomfortable. James Whitmore has very traditional views about social hierarchies. His great-grandfather was a general in the Indian Wars. It's a family legacy thing. Look, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand the reality of hospital politics. Sarah stared at her former mentor in disbelief. So we're supposed to let a baby suffer because of some racist's family legacy? Patricia, that child's mother died bringing him into this world. He has no one except us. Which is exactly why you need to maintain professional distance, Patricia replied firmly. Social services will place him somewhere appropriate. It's not our job to get emotionally involved. That afternoon, Sarah discovered that Daniel's feeding schedule had been reduced even further. When she questioned the day nurse, Jennifer, she was met with awkward silence. Look, Sarah, Jennifer finally said, glancing around nervously. Word is that they want to encourage natural selection, if you know what I mean. Make it easier for social services to handle the situation. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't just neglecting Daniel, they were deliberately weakening him. She felt sick to her stomach as the full scope of the situation became clear. That evening, after her official shift ended, Sarah returned to room 312. Daniel was crying weakly, his small voice hoarse from hours of distress. She picked him up immediately, feeling how much lighter he seemed than just days before. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered, holding him close. "I'm so sorry they're doing this to you." As she fed him from her own supplies, formula she had purchased with her own money, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't stand by and watch this child suffer because of institutional racism disguised as policy. Whatever the consequences, she would not let Daniel become a victim of this hospital's moral bankruptcy. She began staying after her shifts, using her keycard access to care for Daniel during the night hours. She brought better formula, soft blankets from home, and spent hours holding him, talking to him, ensuring he felt loved and valued. But Sarah knew this couldn't continue indefinitely. She was walking a dangerous line, and it was only a matter of time before her defiance would be discovered. The question was, what would she do when that moment came? As she looked down at Daniel, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, Sarah realized that for the first time in her nursing career, she was truly practicing medicine the way it was meant to be practiced, with unconditional compassion and respect for human dignity, regardless of the patient's background or the politics surrounding them. The fight was just beginning. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading came on a grey Thursday morning. She arrived for her shift to find Dr. Harrison, Patricia Collins, and a man in an expensive suit waiting by the nurse's station. The stranger had the cold, calculating look of someone accustomed to wielding power. "Sarah Martinez," the man said, extending a hand she didn't take. "I'm James Whitmore. I believe we need to have a conversation." They escorted her to the conference room, where the fluorescent lights seemed even harsher than usual. Through the window, Sarah could see room 312, where Daniel was alone again. Her heart ached thinking of him waking up without familiar arms to comfort him. "Ms. Martinez," Whitmore began, settling into his chair with the confidence of a man who owned everything around him. "I understand you've been having difficulty following protocol regarding the patient in room 312. If by protocol you mean deliberately neglecting a baby because of his ethnicity, then yes, I've been having difficulty with that," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "That child is a ward of the state. Our responsibility is to provide basic medical care until social services can place him appropriately. Nothing more." Appropriately. Sarah couldn't contain her anger anymore. He's 3 weeks old. He's not a political statement. He's a human being who deserves the same care we'd give any other child. "Let me be very clear about something," Whitmore said, leaning forward. "My family has been fighting the Indian problem in this country for 4 generations. My great-grandfather died at Little Bighorn, defending American values. I will not have this hospital become a sanctuary for their kind." The naked racism in his words left Sarah momentarily speechless. She looked at Dr. Harrison and Patricia, hoping to see some sign of moral outrage, but found only uncomfortable silence. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah said slowly, "that baby had nothing to do with any historical conflicts. He's an innocent child who lost his mother and needs care. Basic human compassion." "Compassion is what's wrong with this country," Whitmore replied coldly. "These people have been nothing but a drain on society. The sooner that child is placed in an appropriate facility, the better for everyone." Sarah realized with growing horror that appropriate facility was likely code for an underfunded, overcrowded placement where Daniel's chances of thriving would be minimal. This wasn't just about hospital policy. It was about systematically ensuring this child had no real chance at life. "I won't be party to this," Sarah said, standing up. "I became a nurse to heal, to care, to protect the vulnerable, not to participate in institutional racism." "Then perhaps you should reconsider your employment here," Whitmore replied smoothly. "Dr. Harrison, I trust you'll handle this situation appropriately. I have a board meeting to attend." After Whitmore left, Dr. Harrison turned to Sarah with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been regret. "Sarah, you're a good nurse, one of our best, but you're putting me in an impossible position. The hospital needs Whitmore's funding. We can't survive without it. So we sacrifice our principles for money. We sacrifice one child to save the programs that help hundreds of others," Patricia interjected. "Sometimes that's how the world works." Sarah looked at both of them, people she had respected, worked alongside, trusted, and realized she was truly alone in this fight. "I need to think about this," she said quietly. That night, Sarah sat in room 312 holding Daniel. He had grown stronger under her secret care, his eyes more alert, his grip firmer when he wrapped his tiny fingers around hers. She had been documenting his progress in her own notes, evidence of what proper care could accomplish. "What am I going to do, Daniel?" she whispered. "They want me to abandon you, but I don't know how to do that." As if in response, Daniel looked up at her with those dark, trusting eyes. In that moment, Sarah realized she had already made her choice weeks ago when she first held him. The question now wasn't whether to fight, it was how to fight effectively. She began formulating a plan. If the hospital administration wouldn't listen to moral arguments, perhaps they would respond to legal and public pressure. Sarah had been documenting everything: the neglect, the discriminatory policies, the deliberate withholding of standard care. She had contacts in the local media, and she knew there were legal advocacy groups that specialized in protecting Native American rights. But taking that step would mean sacrificing her career, burning bridges, and facing powerful enemies. It would mean choosing Daniel over her own security and future. Looking down at the baby, sleeping peacefully in her arms, Sarah realized it wasn't really a choice at all. Some things were more important than job security. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. Tomorrow, she would make the calls that would change everything. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Sarah had contacted Maria Santos, an investigative journalist from the local NBC affiliate, and provided her with documentation of Daniel's case. The headline read, "Local Hospital Accused of Discriminatory Care Against Native American Infant." Sarah arrived at work to find the hospital in chaos. News vans lined the parking lot, reporters cornered staff members for comments, and the administration was in full damage control mode. She was immediately summoned to the director's office. "You've destroyed us," Dr. Harrison said, his face flushed with anger. 20 years I've worked to build this hospital's reputation, and you've undone it all in one morning." "I've exposed the truth," Sarah replied calmly. "If that destroys your reputation, maybe you should examine what that reputation was built on." Hospital Director Margaret Walsh entered the room, followed by 2 security guards. "Ms. Martinez, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." "On what grounds?" "Violation of patient confidentiality, insubordination, and conduct detrimental to the hospital's mission," Walsh replied curtly. "Your access cards have been deactivated and you're banned from hospital property." Sarah's heart sank as the reality hit her. "What about Daniel?" "That's no longer your concern." As security escorted her through the corridors, Sarah caught glimpses of her former colleagues. Some looked away in embarrassment, others watched with sympathy they couldn't express. When they passed room 312, Sarah saw Daniel through the doorway, alone in his crib, and her heart broke. The next few days were a whirlwind of media interviews, legal consultations, and public attention that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The story had gained national traction, spreading across social media platforms and news outlets like wildfire, with Native American advocacy groups, nursing organizations, and civil rights lawyers all becoming involved in what had started as one woman's desperate plea for justice. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm she had never imagined, fielding phone calls from reporters she'd never heard of, and receiving both passionate support and vitriolic criticism from strangers across the country. Her small apartment became a fortress of sorts, with news vans parked outside and her phone ringing incessantly. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, making even simple tasks like grocery shopping feel overwhelming. She had become the face of a movement she hadn't intended to start, carrying the hopes and expectations of countless people who saw in her story a reflection of their own struggles against institutional discrimination. "You understand you'll probably never work in healthcare again," said attorney David Redcloud, a Cherokee lawyer who had taken Daniel's case pro bono. He sat across from Sarah in his modest office, his weathered hands folded on the desk between them, his dark eyes reflecting both compassion and hard-earned wisdom about the realities of challenging powerful institutions. Hospitals don't hire nurses who've sued other hospitals, regardless of the righteousness of the cause. The healthcare industry is smaller than you think, and word travels fast. They'll see you as a liability, someone who might expose their own questionable practices. Sarah nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched coffee cup. She had already accepted that reality during the long, sleepless nights since she'd first spoken out. The nursing community was tight-knit, and while many had privately expressed support for her actions, she understood the professional suicide she had committed. Her savings account, modest as it was after years of student loan payments and supporting her elderly mother, would carry her for a few months at best, but after that, she would need to completely rebuild her career from the ground up, possibly in an entirely different field. The legal battle was swift but decisive, unfolding with a speed that surprised even the experienced attorneys involved. Faced with overwhelming evidence of discriminatory practices, including internal emails that revealed disturbing attitudes toward Native American patients, documented patterns of substandard care based on ethnicity, and the undeniable testimony of multiple staff members who had finally found the courage to speak up, and the looming threat of federal civil rights investigations that could have resulted in the loss of federal funding, St. Mary's Hospital chose to settle out of court rather than face a prolonged and increasingly public trial. The settlement terms, negotiated over grueling weeks of back-and-forth discussions, included comprehensive policy changes that would be monitored by an independent oversight committee, mandatory sensitivity training for all staff from custodial workers to department heads, and a substantial fund established specifically for Daniel's future care, education, and any ongoing medical needs he might have. The hospital also agreed to implement a patient advocacy program and to publicly acknowledge that their previous practices had fallen short of acceptable standards. More importantly to Sarah than any financial settlement, Daniel was placed with a Cherokee family, John and Mary Standing Bear, who had been trying to adopt for years, navigating the complex web of bureaucracy and waiting lists that characterized the foster care system. Sarah was invited to meet them before the placement, and she immediately recognized the love and commitment in their eyes, the quiet strength that spoke of people who had overcome their own struggles and were ready to pour their hearts into caring for a child who needed them. John Standing Bear was a teacher at the local tribal school, his gentle demeanor masking a fierce protectiveness that Sarah could sense even in their brief meeting. Mary worked as a social worker for the tribal council, her own experience with the child welfare system giving her unique insight into what Daniel would need to thrive. Their home, Sarah learned, was filled with the sounds of Cherokee being spoken alongside English, with traditional foods and modern conveniences existing in comfortable harmony. "We've followed his story from the beginning," Mary said, holding Daniel with practiced ease, her voice soft but firm with conviction. "What you did. It takes courage to stand up for what's right when everyone else is looking the other way, when it would be so much easier to just go along with the system as it is." Her hands moved with the natural grace of someone accustomed to caring for children, adjusting Daniel's blanket with unconscious tenderness. "He's a special little boy. Sarah replied, watching Daniel seem to respond to Mary's gentle touch with a contentment she had rarely seen in him during his hospital stay. He deserves every chance at happiness, every opportunity to grow up knowing he's loved and valued for exactly who he is. The words carried the weight of all the nights she had spent advocating for him, all the battles she had fought to ensure this moment could happen. 6 months later, Sarah was working at a community health clinic in a predominantly Native American neighborhood, 2 hours away from the city that had once been her home. The building was older, with floors that creaked and walls that had seen better days, but it hummed with a different kind of energy than the sterile efficiency of St. Mary's. The pay was less than half what she had earned at the hospital, and the facilities were basic, outdated equipment, limited resources, and a constant struggle to secure funding for even essential supplies. But she had never felt more fulfilled in her work, more connected to the true purpose that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. Here she was not just a healthcare provider, but a trusted member of the community, someone who understood that healing involved more than just treating symptoms. She learned about traditional healing practices from the elders who came to the clinic, incorporated cultural sensitivity into every interaction, and found herself becoming fluent in advocacy in ways she had never imagined possible during her years at the hospital. On a warm spring afternoon that carried the promise of summer in its gentle breeze, John and Mary Standing Bear brought Daniel, now called Daniel Standing Bear, his new name carrying the weight of belonging and cultural identity, for his regular checkup. He had grown into a healthy, happy 8-month-old with bright eyes that sparkled with curiosity and an infectious smile that seemed to light up every room he entered. His cheeks were full and rosy, his movements strong and coordinated, and he babbled constantly in the universal language of contented babies. "He's thriving," Sarah said, completing his examination with the thoroughness that had always characterized her work, noting every positive development on his growth chart with satisfaction. "Look at these numbers. He's right where he should be, hitting every milestone perfectly. His weight, his height, his developmental markers, everything indicates a child who is not just surviving, but flourishing." "We wanted to thank you again," John said, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude that had only deepened over the months. Not just for fighting for him in court, not just for taking on the hospital and the system, but for showing him love when no one else would, for holding him and singing to him and making sure he knew he mattered, even when the world seemed to be telling him otherwise. We believe children remember that kindness, even when they're too young to understand it, that it becomes part of who they are as they grow. As Sarah watched the Standing Bear family leave the clinic, Daniel waving his chubby hand from his car seat with the unself-conscious joy that only babies possess, his adoptive parents flanking him with protective love, she reflected on the price she had paid for her stand. The cost had been higher than she had initially imagined. She had lost not just her career and her financial security, but many relationships she had valued, friendships that couldn't survive the controversy, professional connections that had evaporated overnight when she became too political for their comfort. But she had gained something more precious than any salary or professional status, the knowledge that when faced with a moral choice that would define not just her career but her character, she had chosen correctly. She had chosen love over convenience, justice over job security, and the welfare of a vulnerable child over her own professional advancement. The clinic door chimed as her next patient arrived, a young Navajo mother with her newborn daughter, both of them carrying the vulnerability that came with navigating healthcare systems that too often failed to see them as fully human. As Sarah welcomed them with a warm smile that had become her trademark, speaking a few words in Navajo that she had been learning, She realized that this was exactly where she was meant to be, that every step of her journey had led her to this moment, this place, this purpose. Sometimes the most important victories come at the highest personal cost, requiring sacrifices that seem impossible to bear in the moment, but prove to be worth every struggle in the end. They are victories nonetheless, measured not in dollars or professional advancement, but in lives changed, in systems challenged, in the simple but profound act of standing up for what is right when everything else seems wrong. Daniel Standing Bear would grow up loved, valued, and given every opportunity to succeed, surrounded by a community that celebrated his Cherokee heritage and supported his dreams. And somewhere in his earliest memories, perhaps he would carry the echo of a nurse's voice humming gently in a sterile hospital room, reminding him that he was worthy of love from the very beginning, that his life had value that no institution could diminish. The fight had been worth it. Every sleepless night, every professional door that had closed, every relationship that had been strained or lost. It had all been worth it for the chance to give one child the beginning he deserved and to find her own true calling in the process.